So, to say something about the title of the book that we did after that, which is called The Rebirth of Antisemitism in the 21st Century. And to ask a question about that, I think a lot of people thought that anti-Semitism was more or less done by the end of the 20th century. There we go. After the experience of the Holocaust, after the kind of, I suppose, a normalization of democratic thinking and anti-racist thinking, there was still certainly anti-Semitism on the far right, especially in Eastern Europe, in the former communist states, but it was a kind of unsophisticated, kind of street, kind of skinhead type anti-Semitism, which I thought was not particularly likely to catch on, and perhaps there was an Islamist anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism at the heart of an Islamist politics, which was on the rise a little bit, but I wasn't particularly aware of that at the time. So the 21st century begins. Hang on. Oh, wait. Okay. Well, I will scroll like that. So, 2001. At the beginning of 2001 is what sort of turns out to be the final, or apparently the final end of not necessarily of the peace process, but the peace process that existed at that time. At Taba, there was a kind of attempt to resuscitate it, although the Second Intifada had already begun, and the peace process collapsed in a final way, at least for that time. In August 2001, there was the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in South Africa, and it was an interesting moment. So apartheid had been seen by many as a kind of key symbolic form of racism on the planet, and many people were in the anti-apartheid movement worldwide, and of course apartheid had been defeated. And this was 5 or 6 years later, and there was this great big kind of conference at the heart of the fall on apartheid, so it was quite a moment. Excuse me, it was a huge conference. It was an intergovernmental UN conference. It was also a youth and student conference. It was also an NGO conference. And the NGO conference, for example, was at the cricket ground in Durban, which was huge. There were 20,000 people at it or something. And there was the kind of seafront and demonstrations in Durban. I was not there myself. But what happened at Durban was that there was a formidable campaign to construct Zionism as the new key symbolic form of racism globally. So with the fall of apartheid, there was a campaign to kind of replace apartheid in a kind of global popular imagination with Zionism. And what happened at Durban was the kind of bringing back of Zionism equals racism into the mainstream of anti-racist thought after the peace process, in which for a decade or a decade and a half, most people had stopped thinking about Israel as a key and symbolic evil that needs to be destroyed, and were thinking of Israel as a state which needed to make peace and to carry on in a good relationship with its neighbours. This changed after the end of the peace process, and Zionism equals racism had certainly not gone away, but it was quite a minority position. It was a minority position that was held onto by certain layers of people. For example, if you trace the stories of the UN Women's Conferences and quite a lot of discourse at the in UN human rights discourse, and on the far left, then you will find people sort of holding on to an anti-Zionist position, a position that Israel is based on racism is essentially racist, can never be anything but racist. There can be no proper peace between Israel and its neighbours because Israel is a pathology in the same way that apartheid was a pathology. And a lot of the Jews who were at that conference, they were not there as Jews, they were not there representing Jewish NGOs because it was a World Conference Against Racism. They were there in the main because they were anti-racist activists. And what they found was that the new kind of absolutist anti-Zionism, well, it was not new, but it was brought back, I think, into the mainstream at Durban. Well, there was a campaign to do that, and the campaign was pretty successful. And that discourse, that kind of new absolutist anti-Zionism discourse, kind of swirled around at this big, energetic conference with all sorts of really quite explicit anti-Semitic memes and posters. The protocols of the Other Zion were on sale at a stall, and there was a really toxic atmosphere, and I think pretty well everybody who was there says that it was something kind of quite enormous. And what they found, those Jewish anti-racists, was that they found that having devoted their lives to anti-racism, they found that when they were then reporting an experience of anti-Semitism and explaining it at the conference, they found that other people were not listening in the same way that they themselves had been listening. And so, I mean, I want to write a book, actually, of Durban, because it takes some serious explaining to explain why it was so significant for the people who were there and for its effectiveness, actually. The week after Durban ended was 9/11. So, you know, mushroom clouds over lower Manhattan, and the attack on Washington and New York, which you could think of as kind of symbolic of a particular political form of Islamist anti-Semitism. So these three events really may be symbolic, they're not the cause, but it's a moment, I think, which we should take seriously. So the anti-Semitism that we thought had gone away was kind of back. I want to say something quickly about my own discipline, about sociology and critical theory, which is that there's quite a mismatch inside sociology, I think. If you talk to sociologists, then most sociologists and most sociology departments will be quite hostile to the idea that anti-Semitism is a important issue, and especially anti-Semitism on the left and within left liberal politics. And of course, sociology itself is kind of part of that left liberal politics, or that critical engagement with liberal democratic theory and with kind of hegemonic ideas. So sociology as a place, as a discipline, as a space can be quite hostile to this work. On the other hand, Marcel Stutzer makes the argument in a quite compelling way that sociology, in a sense, in its very birth, was, and consciously so, was an attempt to address and to undercut some of the force of anti-Semitism and in particular conspiracy fantasy. Because if you look at the world, it easily looks like it's run by a sort of conspiracy of the powerful. You know, how do all the rich people, the ruling class, how do the men, how do the white people, how do they kind of hold all this power? And it's really easy to be seduced by conspiracy theories about big, deep, dark forces that are behind these apparently liberal democratic states, for example. And what Marcel says is that sociology, and in fact Marxism itself, set about constructing a scientific or structural account of why the world looks like it's dominated by conspiracies, but isn't, right? So in other words, a way of explaining structures of inequality without resorting to conspiracy fantasy, but by trying to give a kind of scientific or structural account. Now, I'm not saying that they necessarily succeeded extremely well, and I'm not kind of making that case for Marxism, for example, but as a sort of attempt to do that, I think it was important, and I think they kind of knew what they were doing. So I think there is a hostility to anti-Semitism at the very heart of sociology, actually, and at the very heart of Marxism in a sense. And I think that there is very little awareness of that in contemporary sociology and contemporary Marxism. I want to just make a nod to the Jewish question, really. So one of the things that we noticed is that often when you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, especially left-wing anti-Semitism, a lot of people are just quite shocked and surprised, and they said, well, I didn't know that is a thing, right? I didn't know that it's even really possible for people on the left to be anti-Semitic. I didn't know, like, it sounds completely mad. It sounds like it couldn't happen. And indeed, Alain Badiou, a kind of big, Maoist philosopher, says very clearly that it's oxymoronic. That if something was anti-Semitic, it couldn't, by definition, be left, and if something was left, it couldn't, by definition, be anti-Semitic. And that's the end of the discussion. And I think that feeling is widespread, and I think it's just a kind of straightforward ignorance about the history of, if I use the word we, if I talk about the left broadly conceived as a kind of big left liberal tradition, if we think that anti-Semitism is something extraordinary within that space, we're just wrong. We just don't know our history. Because all through the 19th century, for example, these questions about the Jewish question, which was the question about what is it about Jews that makes it impossible for them to be emancipated? What is it about Jews that is a kind of enduring problem to the construction of democracy and democratic states and nation states? What is the answer to the Jewish question? And those debates were, I think, fundamentally left liberal debates, right? They were debates about emancipation, about democracy. And of course, there never was a Jewish question, right? There never was a thing about the Jews that made it impossible for them to be emancipated. It was always an anti-Semitism question. It was a question about how society prevented the Jews from having the same rights as everybody else. And so that anti-Semitism and those anti-Semitic kind of debates raged for a very large part of the 19th century. Later, August Bebel, one of the famous sociologists in Germany, referred to anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools, as a kind of, there was an idea that if people thought that if people were railing against Jewish bankers and Jewish capitalists and the Jewish bourgeoisie, then they were kind of nearly there, right? They were kind of nearly there to a consciousness of the structure of banking and the bourgeoisie and capitalism. And so this idea of the socialism of fools, that it was foolish to be anti-Semitic in that way, but it was kind of, it was nearly there, and they were kind of on our side, and they needed educating and taking along with them to a kind of true consciousness. And then, of course, in the 20th century, there is a long and very clear history of Stalinist, communist anti-Semitism, in which, in the Soviet Union, there is a long history, for example, with the doctor's plot, when Stalin was blaming the Jewish doctors around him for trying to murder him, and there was a concrete plan to deport all the Jews from Moscow to the east, in a way that had happened not 5 or 10 years earlier in Germany. By 1952, about the same time as the doctor's plot in Moscow, the whole of the kind of leadership of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia was kind of destroyed. Rudolf Slansky, who was the leader of the Communist Party at the time, was put on trial, accused of bourgeois Jewish nationalism and Zionism. And Slansky was hanged with 11 of his comrades, one of whom was not Jewish. and then a whole layer of Jewish communists under them were kind of put in the Iranian mines and forced labour and the rest of it. And then, you can look at Poland and East Germany in 67, 68, where there was a great big state-sponsored anti-Semitic campaign against Zionists, and Zionists were kind of picked out in Poland, for example, and challenged to disavow their connection to Zionism. And interestingly, a lot of those people didn't even know that they were Jewish, let alone Zionists. And the party knew, the state knew, but they didn't know. So in that case, if someone doesn't even know that they're Jewish and they don't know anything about Zionism and have no connection to it or to Israel, it's kind of evidently an anti-Semitic attack on them. But interestingly, the form of the discourse, the form of the attack, was almost identical to the form that we see today in our time amongst people who consider themselves to be the best anti-racists that there are. And a lot of the anti-Zionist discourse was constructed in the organ of state security in Moscow in the 60s. The stuff about Zionism being apartheid and Zionism being imperialist and Zionism being genocidal was all already created in Moscow. So, it doesn't mean it's wrong, but it does mean that a lot of this stuff was formulated first by people who knew that they were anti-Semitic and who were creating this discourse for that reason. So, anti-Semitism really begins with blood libel. In the first place, especially Christian traditions of anti-Semitism, I would not say at all that Christianity is in itself anti-Semitic, but I would say that there are important traditions of Christianity which were. Christianity is kind of at ease with Jews because especially those histories of Christianity, those traditions of Christianity, think of themselves as having completed the Jewish journey towards the universal, towards the one God, towards the one humanity, towards one redemption. And therefore it was quite annoying to some Christians to find that the Jews were not really interested, that Christianity was very interested in Jews and Jews were not at all interested in Christianity. And so from this idea that the Jews were kind of stubbornly rejecting the good news, there came more destructive discourses, one of which was that by the Jews rejecting Jesus, what they were doing was rejecting and destroying redemption for everybody. So it was not just their own redemption that was destroyed by their refusal to love Jesus, it was universal redemption, and the Jews became this idea of the Jews as a kind of block to universal progress, which I think is key to nearly every form of anti-Semitism that we see. And then it moved kind of onwards from there to not only the Jews rejecting Jesus and the Jews creating a block to progress for the universal, but also Jews murdered Jesus, and Jews are responsible for reenacting the murder of Jesus on the bodies of non-Jewish children, and very proud to be British, where this habit of accusing the Jews of murdering children started in the 11th and 12th century in Norwich and Lincoln. So that's a history of Jews being accused of a kind of absolute evil, right? Not an instrumental evil, right? Not stealing your money or killing you in order to take your money, but the murder of God. Just absolute, unreasonable, irrational evil for its own sake, pure evil. And the ways that in medieval times people started to think about Jews and to picture them became quite similar to how they pictured the devil, as a kind of inhuman entity, evil in its face, inhuman in its claws and with its horns. And also there were interestingly some versions of this by which Jews were kind of putting reason to work. They were reasoning with good, innocent, faithful Christians to reason them out of their faith, and reason became a kind of evil Jewish and devilish trick against a kind of authentic understanding of what was good. So I think this image of this kind of ugly image of the Jewish face as being the thing that is A, of pure evil, and B, the thing that destroys the possibility of a better life for everybody, or of utopia for everybody, I think that endures throughout different instantiations of anti-Semitism. Or to put it another way, that is an image that becomes useful to anyone in the future who is operating with a kind of conspiracy fantasy by which there is a dark force that prevents us all from living a decent, normal life. So the humanization of that evil force with a Jewish face, and anyone who's read George Orwell's 1984 will know that George Orwell understood that this is one of the key operating procedures of 20th century totalitarianism, not only Nazism but also Stalinism. That, and in his kind of fictionalized version, there is in every workplace, in every university, there is 2 minutes hate every day where everybody gathers around a telescreen and they hate this enemy of Big Brother, who his name is Emmanuel Goldstein, and he has this great big Jewish face, and they hate the Jewish face because the Jewish face is what stands behind the disruption of the journey to utopia. Of course, Big Brother is perfect, right? The state is perfect, so why is everything so awful? And totalitarianism, and actually populism to a lesser extent, promise utopia, but they never deliver, for obvious reasons. So they need to carry on the understanding of the deep, dark forces that are against the people, even when the people are apparently in charge. The deep, dark forces continue to destroy everything in secret. And again, anti-Semitism, it's not that those ways of thinking are all anti-Semitic, and they're not necessarily anti-Semitic, and they're not inherently anti-Semitic. It's just this is a really fertile ground for anti-Semitism. Why? Because there are these anti-Semitic images of the Jew that really resonate in our culture and in other cultures. I mean, in cultures across the world, they really resonate, and people embrace them. So if you are involved in that kind of politics, which is always anti-democratic politics, it always says that democracy, the democratic state, is a kind of fake, is an image behind which lies the real power. And if you then give this space to that power, then it kind of works for you. It's like people reach for the anti-Semitic image because it does some work for them and it increases their power and increases their plausibility. And Semitism is not just something that we kind of find that lies around in the world, but it's something that people reach for, and they reconfigure these kind of emotionally virulent tropes and images. And interestingly, with contemporary anti-Semitism, they often reach for these tropes and images, but without any real consciousness or knowledge that that is what they were doing. And that's quite a problem for sociology, actually, the idea of agency and responsibility for an anti-Semitism that, of which people are not aware. This is Moishe Postone, taught at Chicago, University of Chicago, for some time, until he's now died. But Moishe was very clear about the authentically left-wing tradition of anti-Semitism. He says this: anti-Semitism is particularly dangerous because it appears to be the oppression, I need my bloody glasses, the expression of a movement of the little people against an intangible global form of domination. Now, that is slightly different from most Marxist accounts anyway of racism. which positioned racism as being something created by the state and used against powerless individuals or powerless communities. Moish says that one of the histories of anti-Semitism is that it has been used against the powerful, actually, and against the state. So that kind of socialism or fools tradition is interestingly slightly different from a picture of racism. Now I'm going to talk to you about hyphens, because I know that will make you happy. Most scholars of anti-Semitism don't write anti-Semitism in the way above with the hyphen and the capital S. And the reason for that is, I think, a growing feeling and awareness that there is no Semitism which anti-Semitism constructs a worldview in relation to. In other words, there's no Semitism out there in the world that anti-Semitism is against. And so most people nowadays write it without the hyphen and without the capital just to kind of be a nod towards that idea that Semitism is a self-created creation of anti-Semitism. And I suspect that anti-Zionism and anti-Zionism, with the hyphen and without the hyphen, is increasingly becoming a similar or an analogous distinction. So evidently there has been in the world Zionism. It's arguable, it's debatable about whether there is in the world today Zionism or whether there is simply Israel, right? There is a state pursuing what it thinks to be its own interests. And incidentally, there is a kind of payoff for referring to this state which is pursuing its own interests or its own conception of its own interests. There is a payoff of referring to it as an ism, as a movement. Because a movement can be right or wrong. It can be something that you support or something that you don't support. It can be something you think is really good or something you think is dangerous and you want to replace with something else. A nation state isn't like that, right? You can't sort of say, well, France is, we need to destroy France because France is inherently bad, or Canada, or... Of course, nation states change. I mean, you might say that you would like to build a European state and you would like to incorporate France into it. Fine, but that would be a kind of democratic process with the consent of French people, and they would presumably develop their own notion of Frenchness, which would then be in some relationship to a notion of Europeanness. But nobody says, well, some of the nation state is kind of, in its essence, racist or threatening. But that was a little distraction. That was just the point about the payoff. But, people want to call it the Zionist entity or the entity or whatever. I think that's sort of because you can't talk about a nation state in that way. You can't say, well, the nation state is wrong, it's inherently bad, and it needs to be destroyed. Whereas you can talk about an ideology in that way. So, to go back to the idea of hyphens, it seems to me that there have been movements against Zionism. Certainly when Zionism was an idea, when it was a movement, then some people, in the first place, Jews, were against it and made arguments against it in favour of, generally on the left, the kind of radical movements against anti-Semitism were some form of universalistic socialism, Bolshevism, and Buddhism, which was a kind of, they used to call it Zionism without passports, right? It was a kind of Jewish identity politics, a creation of a capacity for Jewish self-defense, and actually a kind of creation of a new Jewishness, because the Bundists were quite radical people, and they didn't want to have their Jewishness as a religion. They didn't want to go to synagogue. They didn't want the rabbis saying what was Jewishness, and they were trying to create a new kind of Jewish identity, actually. Bundism, and then you had Zionism, people who said, well, actually we need the capacity for self-defense, and we need that in the same way that every other nation state needs it, and that's what we should do. We should go and build a state which will give us the capacity for self-defense. And I mean, fundamentally, these three ideologies were all fairly radical opposition movements to anti-Semitism. And they were also, all three of them were pretty utopian, right? Meaning that they had very little chance of succeeding, any of them. Nobody wanted to go to Israel, and, you know, like, well, some people went to Israel, like a few people did, but the overwhelming majority of people, you don't leave your country and go somewhere else until you're afraid. And that's generally why people move around in this world. But it's also noticeable that Jews basically don't live in the same places where they lived 100 years ago at all. So Jews lived in the great cities of the Middle East. They lived in Russia, they lived in Ukraine, they lived in Eastern Europe, Germany, and today they live, basically half of them live in North America and the other half of them live in Israel. And that's it. I mean, there are little communities like in Britain and Australia and South Africa, but basically from Eastern Europe, the Middle East and Russia, they moved to, the Middle Eastern Jews all concentrated into Israel and North America. So that's the beginning of a distinction between a kind of rational critique of a political idea, a political ideology on the one hand, and a campaign against a situation in the world that has been created by huge material forces and changes in Jewish life. So by 1948, Jews had been, murdered in Europe and were running for their lives, and Jews across the Middle East were being, over the next decade or two, driven out of their homes, and there's a reason for that, right? Which is that colonialism generally, the force that opposes and defeats colonialism is nationalism, or at least nationalism from within and a kind of pressure from other colonial powers from without. And across the Middle East, there was a rise of anti-colonial Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism was a nationalism that defined itself not in a kind of civic way for all of its, for all the citizens of the place, but ethnically in terms of Arab self-defense and Arab liberation from imperialism. And one of the results of that was that very often the kind of Arab nationalism that won out inside Arab states was one that did not consider minorities to be part of the nation. And one of the minorities in the Middle East was Jews. There were others, and none of them did especially well in the world of anti-colonial nationalism. And so when people talk about Israel as being a kind of uniquely ethnic state, it's a very strange idea, because actually the whole of the Middle East was constructed by anti-colonial nationalism, to which were to one extent or another ethnic. And of course Israel is in some ways an ethnic state, but is in some ways not an ethnic state. So the two kind of parts of its aspiration really sit uneasily together, which also brings you to also as a sociologist, I would like to say that I would resist kind of philosophical or a priori arguments about how either that Zionism is necessarily racism or genocidal, or that anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic because Zionism is a movement for national independence, and this is the only one that is thought to be not legitimate. The problem with that, of course, is that I think you have to look empirically. You have to start by looking at the world. So if you want to know if if Zionism is racism, you have to start by looking at the world and seeing what happens, and not by saying, well, you know, Zionism says that Jews can't live in Europe and they have to live in their own state and it has to be their state and therefore inherently it's racist. You have to say, well, history gave the Jews who went to the Middle East, history, I don't know if that's a bit of a kind of Marxist gobbledygook, history gave them two tasks, right? One was to build a democratic state, and the other was to build a refuge for Jews and a state in which the Jewish capacity for self-defense was nurtured. And it's obvious why after 1945 there were Jews who wanted to nurture the Jewish capacity for self-defense. Throughout the 30s and the 40s, the Jews were, you know, waiting patiently for international human rights or international human rights organisations to come to their aid, and that did not happen. So it's quite interesting, like, because often people in quite an offhand way, they say, well, the Jews should have learned this or that or the other from the 30s or the 40s or from the Holocaust. And one of the things that many Jews learned was we need the capacity for self-defense. And in the modern era, the capacity for self-defense means a state. So you can't tell whether Zionism is racism by just thinking about it. You have to look at the world. You have to say history gave these two tasks to the Israelis, and then you can ask empirically how well did they carry them out? How successful was this contradiction kind of held together? Because, of course, at least if you're a Marxist, all states are contradictory, right? The things that states say about themselves, about their universality, are contradictory to the reality of states as particular forms, and especially forms that represent the powerful. So it's not new to us that there should be a state which has contradictory requirements. So the question, and the answer I think is pretty straightforward, that sometimes Israel did pretty well in holding together the idea of a Jewish state or a Jewish self-defense with the idea of democracy. Sometimes it did pretty well, and sometimes it didn't do so well. And I think that is a kind of sociological method of looking at the question. So anti-Zionism as a movement or a worldview based on a Zionism which has been invented by anti-Zionism, as opposed to the idea of anti-Zionism as a movement which is critical of something that exists in the world. So here's an example of an anti-Zionism which is not a kind of rational critique of something that exists in the world, but is a worldview and ideology based around the conception of Zionism which it itself had constructed. And just to introduce this also, Nazism and its anti-Semitism portrayed the Jews as the key to history. The Nazis thought the Jews were the key to history. If you didn't understand the Jews and their part in the world, you could understand nothing, according to Nazism. And there is an anti-Zionism in that way that if you don't understand Zionism, if you don't understand Israel, then you can't understand anything. Because if you need to understand the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, then you need to understand the role of Zionism in teaching the American cops how to murder a black man, right? This might sound very strange to you, but some of you will recognize this as an explanation or a connection made from the George Floyd murder to Israel and Zionism. As if American cops needed Zionism to teach them how to murder a black man. I mean, it's just a very odd assumption. So this quote from Stephen Salater, who's an academic in America, quote, "Zionism is part and parcel of a unilateral administrative power. It lends itself to top-down decision-making, to suppression of anti-neoliberal activism, to restrictions on speech, to colonial governance, to corporatization and counter-revolution, Zionism. In other words, Zionism behaves in universities here precisely as it does in various geopolitical systems. I mean, I don't even know what is meant there by various geopolitical systems, given that the state of Israel is a very small state on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean in a conflict with a small Palestinian people. But anti-Zionism constructs it into the centre of the world. It gives it world significance. And it seems to me that that form of anti-Zionism is when anti-Zionism goes beyond some notion of being a kind of critique of things that Israel does or Israeli policy into being a notion that, again, that Israel is the key to history, is the key to understanding everything in the world. So, if that makes any sense, the idea of anti-Zionism being a worldview constructed around a Zionism which anti-Zionism itself has invented, then let's think for a moment about race and racism and how that works in relation to this. And it's interesting that if you go back to the beginning of thinking about racism, thinking was pretty straightforward, that race itself was not, and this is kind of at the heart of sociological understandings of race, race is not something that you can observe in nature. Race is not something you can observe in nature. What race does as a social formation is it takes particular aspects of human beings or particular biological aspects of human beings and it endows them with huge explanatory significance. And that's how you create races. You take trivial differences amongst human beings and you make them appear hugely and symbolically significant. And then you attach power differences to them. And so, interestingly, if that's how anti-Zionism works, if anti-Zionism constructs Zionism as a huge, globally significant distinction for everyone in the world, then how does that relate to Jews, in fact? Or how does it relate to Zionists? And what are Zionists and what are Jews? Those are both very big, difficult questions. And actually, I don't think we even really need to go into them at this stage, because how Jews see themselves, or how Jews see their own Zionism, is, in a very material sense, neither here nor there. Just as how a person thinks of their own race is kind of neither here nor there, because people's race is put onto them from outside in a hostile way, at least in the first place. You can embrace a very lovely notion of blackness as wholeness, as liberational, but if you're walking down the street and a bunch of white people define you as black, and by that they mean someone they want to beat up, then it doesn't matter what your own understanding of your blackness is. What matters is their understanding. And by analogy, actually, what matters here is not your own understanding of what it means to be Jewish or to be Zionist. What matters is the Zionism that is thrust upon you by hostile people in a hostile way from outside. And what Zionism means in that context is racism. If somebody is interpolated, is kind of fingered as a Zionist, it means that it is being said that they are a racist, they are pro-colonial, they are pro-apartheid, and in our day that they are complicit with genocide. And you might say, well, hang on a minute, you know, I'm a Zionist and my Zionism means this or that or the other. I'm a good guy, right? My Zionism means that I've been part of the peace process for 40 years and, you know, I teach my children Arabic and I'm being for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't matter, because what matters is the Zionism that you are being defined as from outside. Now, there is a possibility of gaining a kind of exceptional status as a Jew who's okay, and you can gain exceptional status as a Jew who's okay if you stipulate not that you are an anti-racist and that your Zionism is decent and peace-loving and anti-racist. That's not enough. You have to stipulate, in our day and age, it's pretty simple, you have to stipulate that Israel is murdering children deliberately and committing genocide, and you have to stipulate that Zionists raise the issue of anti-Semitism in the hope of delegitimizing or silencing criticism of Israel. And if you stipulate to those two things, then you can gain exceptional Jew status and you can escape from, for example, BDS or the opprobrium or the contempt of your colleagues in a university. Although you will have to state it in precisely the terms offered, and you will have to state it whenever they ask, right? You will have to keep stating it. You kind of, interestingly, Nazism is the only anti-Semitism, I think, in history that allowed no exceptional Jews, because it was based on an idea of a Jewish race. Nazism racialized Jews, made Jews into a race. It's quite difficult to do because Jews look completely different from each other, right? There's a huge diversity amongst Jews, but Nazism worked hard to do it, and it succeeded in doing it. At least it succeeded in doing it enough to perpetrate the Holocaust across the whole of Europe. So Nazism didn't allow an exceptional Jew. The Spanish Inquisition, for example, did, right? If you embraced Jesus and if you became a Christian, you could escape from the Inquisition and the torture and the killing in Spain. Although, again, it was never quite there, never quite enough. You know, they would still check your house to make sure that your fire was burning on Shabbat, or they'd still offer you paella to make sure that you were ready to eat the prawns, and they wouldn't let you marry their daughters. But so actually, exceptional status was never quite respected, even when it was offered. And that, by the way, I think is the same with Jewish anti-Zionism also, that in the end, and you can see it as a kind of progression, in the end, anti-Zionism will never find Jewish anti-Zionists to be sufficiently anti-Zionist. What's the time? I've got like about 4 hours more to do, which I will not do. I will try and think of a couple of things that I really want to say. Look at all this really interesting stuff that you are missing. Oh, lots of it. So, just to say that, and I have said it already, that it seems to me that the charge that Israel is currently committing genocide is also a charge that Israel is deliberately and in a planned and deliberate way murdering children and murdering civilians, is a charge which A, is not true, and B, is related to accusations of deliberately murdering children that have been levelled against Jews forever. I can say a little bit more about that, and I can look at my copy of the Genocide Convention and we can talk about it. But it seems to me that it's untrue and it's actually blood libel. Now, what that means is that in public discourse, in universities and also in newsrooms, blood libel has become legitimate. At least, not necessarily that everybody agrees that it's true, but everybody agrees that it's a legitimate position. And that it should be defended on the basis of freedom of speech and non-academic freedom. And that's quite a serious state of affairs, I think. Let me just introduce you to Ken Livingston, who was our mayor of London for a long time in two different forms. And he was kind of quite a popular socialist politician in London, quite a, an interesting guy, quite well liked, and for reasons that I won't go into, but actually are trivial and reasons that are absolutely nothing to do with Israel, that he said and did things which some people said were anti-Semitic. And they were anti-Semitic, but they were kind of trivial as well. There you go. So Livingston did not apologise and say, yeah, I shouldn't have said that. What he did instead was just say this. He wrote an article in The Guardian, and he said, for far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been. In other words, he said that when you hear the accusation of anti-Semitism, your first instinct, especially if it's on the left, your first instinct should be, what are they up to? What are they up to? The people who are accusing, who are making an accusation of anti-Semitism, the people who are raising the issue of anti-Semitism, the academics who want to study anti-Semitism, the academics who write a book called Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, what are they really up to? And you should at least initially think that perhaps what they're really up to is trying to use an accusation of anti-Semitism against people who are perfectly respectable critics of Israel and defenders of human rights. And if you read this carefully, what he said, this is not a claim that Jews quite often just get it wrong. Because of the history, they sometimes think that something is anti-Semitic when it turns out that, in my judgment, it's not. That's not what this says. What this says is this is about a deliberate, actually, conspiracy to use an accusation of anti-Semitism in bad faith, to raise an accusation knowing that it's not true, in the hope of achieving some kind of political result. Now, the reason why I gave this a name and called it a Livingston formulation is because when I saw him do it, suddenly the penny dropped in my little head, and I said, gosh, I've seen this a lot. I've seen that when somebody raises the issue of anti-Semitism, or somebody makes an accusation of anti-Semitism, or somebody says, I experienced something, some kind of exclusion in my Labour Party branch, or in my academic trade union, or in my sociology department, I've experienced a kind of exclusion, or in my feminist movement, I've experienced a kind of exclusion that I should not have experienced, and I want to raise it and talk about it and have it looked at. The standard response is to say, we know what you're up to, you're lying, and you are raising it in bad faith in order to, in our day, in order to excuse genocide. And that's a very serious allegation, and that is the way, the mechanism by which Jews tend to be excluded from spaces, social spaces in which they thought that they were at home, they thought they were one of the people there, but if they, and this goes back to the beginning of my talk at Durban, when Jews said, hang on, we shouldn't have the protocols being sold here, we shouldn't have people raising banners saying Hitler was right, because if the Jews had been killed, then they would not be able to occupy Palestine. When Jews tried raising those issues, and they were told, we know what you're doing, you're just trying to delegitimize criticism of Israel, and you're not here as proper anti-racists, or you're not here as proper Labour Party members, or you're not here as proper trade unionists, or you're not here as a proper sociologist, or a novelist, or member of parliament, or whatever it might be, but you're here only as a Jew, as part of a kind of conspiracy to dishonestly disrupt people's ability to protest against Israeli human rights abuses. So I think that's a pretty standard form. And just to say, obviously such forms are common amongst racists of all kinds, and amongst misogynists, and amongst homophobes, and amongst Islamophobes. The difference, though, is that generally anti-racist scholars and anti-racist activists are able to recognise those responses pretty easily and pretty quickly. I think I will end there for the moment. Oh, I have to end there for the moment. And I will open it up to questions and discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Regarding the blood libel on children, because Gaza is devastating, you have thousands of children that have died. I've seen quotes of Hamas spokespeople who say that they try to, the human shields thing of the people in the homes is like a method for, against Zionist warplanes, where they won't hit because there's people in there. Is it possible, because of how condensed Gaza is, that when the IDF drops a leaflet, or they try and say, move south or move somewhere away, that Hamas pushes them and says, no, you must stay? Is that a dynamic?
So, look, what is clear is that Gaza has been an absolute disaster for the people who live there over the last year and a half. And the suffering and the deaths of people has been huge and appalling. That's clear. How to stop that and what the reasons are for that, I think, is another question. So, one possible explanation is genocide. There's an Israeli wish to destroy Palestinians as a whole, or in whole or in part, and they are murdering Palestinians in the hope of achieving that goal. So the goal comes first, and the mechanism comes as a way of achieving the goal. The other kind of broad explanation for what's going on is different, which is this, is that a force of people on the 7th of October who are explicitly motivated by Nazi-like anti-Semitism as an ideology, invaded Israeli territory from Gaza, and they killed about 1,000 people in a day, and they killed about another 200 or 300 people who were trying to defend those people. So you can say that they were combatants. And that force then withdrew and kind of ran away, went back to Gaza, and it took something like 250 hostages with it. And the strategy was very clear, I think. Israelis said, we can't have this. We can't have 1,000 Jews being murdered in a day, as though we still lived in Ukraine or as though we still lived in Poland. We have the capacity for self-defense, and we can't have this. And the Hamas strategy was to say, well, you have had it, and you will have it, and we will do it more. And you can't do anything about it, because if we run away and go back to Gaza and hide amongst the tunnels and amongst the cities and amongst where people live, if we do that, you can't get to us other than by risking the lives of a lot of innocent Palestinian civilians. And we know that would cause huge political problems for you, and we know that you don't really want to kill thousands of Palestinian civilians, and we know you're not going to do it. And therefore, we're going to withdraw. Alternatively, we know that you will do it, and we want you to do it because that is our political strategy. You should remember that Hamas as a political organization was, it emerged during the late 80s, really, in Palestine, in Gaza, and in the West Bank, and it emerged as a political force whose key aim was to destroy the peace process. Yasser Arafat, the PLO, were trying to negotiate a deal with the Israelis whereby they would live together side by side and in peace, and the Israelis would withdraw from the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And Hamas believed that such a peace agreement was a violation of their profound religious principles, and came into existence to prevent it. And the way they tried to prevent it was to cause war between the Israelis and Palestinians. So there was a kind of coalition between the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli leadership to bring all of the people along to a two-state solution and a peace agreement. And then there were the kind of extremists on both sides who wanted to create the conditions in which there would be war, and the conditions in which people on both sides would be so angry with the other side that they would not trust them in a peace process. And so Hamas pursued the strategy of murdering Israelis, of blowing up buses and blowing up restaurants and places like that. So that was Hamas politics. So the Israelis said, well, yeah, actually we're going to. we're going to come after you, and we will, they say, we will try to minimize casualties, but that's very difficult for us, but we're not going to allow you to just kill 1,000 Jews in a day and run away. Now, I don't particularly want to make any case right now about whether that was a good strategy or a bad strategy, or what they might have done otherwise, or what other things they might have chosen. That's what they did. And that is war, right? They said, we're going to make war, we're going to defeat that political force and that military force that has just killed 1,000 Jews, and we're going to defeat them, and whatever the cost. And the laws of war are very clear about that, actually. And the techniques of war are also pretty well known, that if you fight a war in a built-up area where there are lots of civilians, it's a horrible, horrible business, and a lot of people die. But what we have kind of lost hold of, I think, in public discourse is the distinction between war and genocide and crimes against humanity and crime. And it's quite interesting, you know, the history of it, that there was a time when people were not really bothered about war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanity. They just thought that that was a natural part of war. They thought that if somebody wins a war, then they will, you know, kill all the enemies or commit mass sexual violence or these kinds of things. And through the 19th century and the 20th century in particular, there emerged bodies of international law which stated not that war was illegal, but that particular kinds of things during war were prohibited. So the murder of civilians, for example, and that if civilians were if civilians were killed, then it had to be lawful. It had to be part of a kind of proportional military response. And then, of course, after the Holocaust, people thought long and hard about genocide as a kind of... actually, the Genocide Convention says that genocide is an old phenomenon, but it's a newly named phenomenon. So it used to be thought that war was just incorporated all this, and then there was laws of war and laws of what you were allowed to do outside of war. But we seem to have kind of come to a situation today where war itself is not recognised as possible or as legitimate. Self-defence is not recognised. And actually, I think in reality, what we have today is a situation where any war that somebody doesn't agree with is considered illegal and crime against humanity or genocide. and any war which you support is considered fine. And that is certainly a departure from the idea of defining particular kinds of things which were prohibited in fighting war. So I think it's very clear that what is happening in Gaza is not genocide. And whether or not you think it's good policy, I think is another question, which we could discuss, but it's not really especially relevant for today.
Very good. And Israel High.
What? Oh.
And Israel High.
All right. Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk recently about Israel employed the Hamburg Directive.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit? I can just see.
Sorry, there's been a lot of talk lately about if Israel used the Hamburg Directive during October 7th, basically where the state opts to kill its own citizens to avoid prisoners of war being taken. So I'm not sure if you.
Do you mean to avoid people being taken to Gaza?
Yes.
Okay. And those are prisoners of war?
People being taken to Gaza, whatever it may be, what implications does that have on anti-Semitism, or is the story like not true?
So I think that firstly the kind of failure of Israeli self-defense on the 7th of October was formidable. I mean, people, lots of people didn't like Netanyahu for one reason or another, but a lot of people thought, well, at least he'll keep us safe, right? At least he'll give us security. And they voted for that government, and they completely failed to defend the border. And I think that in the first hours and many hours of 7th of October, there were actually very few Israeli forces present. The evidence is that people were able to kind of go into the area from quite a long way away. There were Israeli forces engaging Hamas forces, but in quite a haphazard way. I think the idea that you can really explain the death of the Israelis by saying that they were murdered by the Israeli government, I think, firstly, it is wrong. I think it's not empirically reality. But secondly, I think that even if it was true that a lot of Israelis were killed by so-called friendly fire, that if the Israelis were engaging the Hamas forces and people were killed in the crossfire accidentally, which I'm sure they were, then I think the responsibility for those deaths lies on the people who started the war, I think. Yeah.
Just for clarification, I'm not talking about accidental crossfire. We're talking about intentional killing. It's called the Hamburg Directive, where it's intentionally used to avoid hostages being taken.
So the idea is that the Israeli forces saw Hamas people taking Israelis across the border to Gaza, and they killed them all together. They went and killed the Hamas guys and the Israelis deliberately so that there would be no prisoners. That's the argument, right? I obviously don't know about that. It seems kind of unlikely to me.
It's true. It's true. They do impose this. Historically, the hostage crisis with terrorists taking hostages is it's a crisis. They always crazy demands and the hostages usually die, including Munich, when all the Israeli Olympians were killed. So this policy is for tragedies, like when terrorists take hostages, and they imposed it, and less hostages were taken. And now,
if that was a policy, it was not a very successful policy, given that 250 Israelis were taken into Gaza. It was like a wholly unsuccessful policy, And it would have been easy, you would have thought, with a few helicopters to prevent that from happening at all, actually. Anyone else want to ask a question or make a point? Yeah.
So, you were talking about self-defense, how Israel should be. I think you were saying in connection with Zionism, it's also the fight for Israel to be able to defend itself, right? Self-defense. And I was wondering if you knew anything about the Geneva Convention, if while doing self-defense, if Israel is breaking the Geneva Convention, specific laws.
Do you mean about what kind of things you're allowed to do in self-defense, or do you mean that the Geneva Convention is about occupying territory?
The first option.
Okay. So I'm not an expert on the minutiae of military strategy and what is legal and what is not. In broad terms, it is not legal to kill enemy combatants when they have surrendered. It is not legal to target civilians deliberately if there is no military necessity for that targeting. There are various other kinds of things that it's not legal to do. There are some kinds of weapons that are not legal, like the use of poison gas. And so the laws of war crimes, prohibit certain kinds of behavior in war. And actually, as far as I understand it, it makes no difference if it's a defensive war or an aggressive war. The law about aggressive war, actually in Nuremberg there were three sets of laws, right? There was war crimes, there was crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. And the one crime that was never really prosecuted was crime against peace. It was never prosecuted in Nuremberg successfully, and it's never been prosecuted since, because it's very difficult to do. But so notionally, you could have there is a law against aggressive warfare, against invading somebody else's country, but the war crimes do not depend on a war being just or unjust. Like so again, if there was an incursion into Israel, if it had only focused on military targets, for example, or if it had only focused on targets which it said were strategic, then there could be an argument that that was legal. You might think it was wrong. You might think that a kind of an aggressive invasion would be really wrong, but in terms of the laws of war and war crimes, it would not necessarily be legal. So I think we should understand that lots of things which we find shocking are not illegal. So there's that distinction. Anyone else before you get a third go? We can close it. Shall we give you a quick third go and then close it?
I just think the most important thing to know is that this is a war of attrition, because the first hostage Hamas gave was 10,094 Palestinian prisoners. These are violent offenders that would likely go back to do it again, for all the hostages in the lifting of the blockade. So they could get tanks and different other things to wage more war.
Is it a question?
It's more just, I just want to make it clear that it's a war of attrition, and what Israel's doing is right. They denied it, and, it's either getting pushed out.
We can come here to listen.
No,
It might be a question. Yes.
Okay. So given that anti-Semites don't believe that they're anti-Semitic, or many of them don't.
Yes.
And it seems that so many Jewish organizations are pouring money into finding, the cure for anti-Semitism, or, EBI training that addresses anti-Semitism, but if you try to present it to people that, well, that's not making them anti-Semitic, so then would it be a better use of their money to pour it into, Jewish private organizations, or, teaching Jewish people about their knowledge, their history, to kind of make them more secure and confident, or essentially how do we try and address anti-Semitism when people don't want to listen to us and see us as unreliable narrators or people with a conflict of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, really, and I don't especially have an answer for that. So I'd be happy to leave that question as a question to the group, really. Okay. Thank you, people.
After that, if you have another question, Dr. Hirsh is here. So first of all, I want to thank you so much for coming here. It's been such a privilege. I didn't do my proper introduction right before because I was a little... but Dr. Hirsh is one of the pioneers in the field of contemporary anti-Semitism studies, and a lot of people are right now in various fields of academics trying to figure out like how, have questions and want to research. And there are people who have been doing it, especially since Jordan, as now you know what happened in Jordan in 2001. And Professor Hirsh is one of them. He directs the Center for Contemporary Anti-Semitism Research in London. He also has pioneered with a conference on contemporary anti-Semitism, which hopefully I'll be joining for the first time in London. So we can also learn more about that. Today, you catch just the tip of the iceberg of an entire field. And obviously, it goes, in an hour, we cannot, know everything. But what's important here is to know that there is empirically based research that can, first of all, understand what the problem is, because you cannot fix a problem you don't understand. So a lot of us, think we know, we think we have definitive answers, but the point of a university is to really try to get to the root of it, to the bottom of it, and collectively and collaboratively come to us. So thank you for all the work you've been doing and all the support you're giving to a lot of the scholars. I also want to thank the Broad Coalition Against Anti-Semitism for hosting today's event. And I want to thank Congregation in Israel, QP 4207, and Chabad Campus for helping sponsor this event. And of course, thank to all of you for taking the time of your day. Things are busy, especially now in March, but to take this time to come and be part of the conversation is admirable, and I'm deeply grateful on behalf of the CAA and all of us. So thank you so much. Oh, there are 14 people online too, so thank you to the online folks who joined us. A little plug in. So this is like just the tip of the iceberg of a whole, research in anti-Semitism. So as we know, a lot of the problems happen, the root of a lot of contemporary anti-Semitism in academia, and the solutions should play, in academia as well. And we are honored to be hosting AdRock in May. Joanna, co-chair of the symposium, a symposium on anti-Semitism that will bring scholars from various fields and disciplines to discuss it. So it's nothing, close to like a big conference in London that will have a lot of panels, but here's a, small, modest version of starting the conversation and bringing in scholars and engaging folks. So you're all welcome, May 5th to 7th. You can look online at antisemitismsymposium.com.
Can I just say, to find out more about what we do in London, the London Centre, look for londonantisemitism.com and find us and find our books and our journal and what we do.
Thank you so much.